YouTube notification about it. As well as one that said that this one was already, had started live streaming.
Oh, yay.
And maybe it is. Hello, everyone.
I'm Karen, by the way.
I'm Karen, my name's John. Sorry.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
John, you said?
Yes.
Okay, I can remember that.
What's your interest in?
So I have a startup that
Oh, yeah.
will probably need to use APIs, and I need to learn. I understand it, but I need to really understand it.
Yeah.
I need to just dig into what that truly looks like as far as pitching it and engaging with the big guys, working with giants. It's like, I need to be able to talk to Hobby Lobby about an API. I need to talk to Best Buy about an API. I need to talk to Whole Foods about an API. I need to be able to talk to the language of these
So
companies.
you using their API or they're using yours, or both?
So, and what it would be involved with for me to have an API for mine, because that's what my business model is gonna
What
have
is
a
it?
consumer element to it.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to, create a promo code, coupon, model format of integration into my site
Yeah.
to reward my users. So how does that work with Whole Foods? How does that work? Because they all have these APIs that you attach to, but my technical knowledge,
Yeah.
I'm in sales, but I need to know how to pitch
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I need to understand the technical side of it.
Yeah.
So, but you said you had written those in the past, you understand?
Oh, well, I've been doing work with computers and computer programming for about 35 years, so
Mhm.
APIs have been kind of a standard part of being a programmer. If you're gonna use another piece of logic and functionality that somebody else wrote, they tell you, well, here's the deal. Here's the name you've gotta use to call it by, right? And here's the information I need to do that job, right? And if you give me those, then I will return to you this kind of information, or I will do this
Okay.
for you. So it's kind of like a contract.
Right,
In fact, that's what some people will call it.
right.
It's like a software contract. And so your software can be a consumer of somebody else's software, meaning you're using their API to get something done. Or if you want to think about it, it's like making a telephone call out to do something, or they could call into your site with an API that you publish, and you say, okay, if you want to be able to perform actions on my site, or for me to give you information, here's what you're gonna need to tell me,
Right.
and here's what I will give you back.
Hi.
Different
Okay.
companies will charge you different things about making those kinds of API calls, like
Right.
so much money for up to 1,000 calls a month.
Right, okay, so.
Right, for this kind of
Kind of the
information.
CPM model of like what my user's action is like.
Yeah, and
Okay.
so it's, and
To
now,
get some crackers or cookies. Is there gonna be any
snacks, food.
snacky stuff, or do I need to go downstairs and get myself a quick
Yeah,
snack before I-
no food this week.
Okay.
Yeah.
I need some sustenance before I
Yeah.
get into this, so I've got 15 minutes.
Oh yeah, you got plenty of time. I think we'll probably actually start the lightning talks about 20 or 30 after,
Okay.
depending on how brave we feel in terms
Because I
of
see
time.
we have Shiner beer, and I understand that that's been my sustenance before, as I've needed to have heavier beer. It can give me sustenance during
For
lunch, but it's 7 o'clock.
A certain amount of time,
I need more than that Shiner beer,
and then you will,
especially since I was just at a happy hour and I already had a half glass of wine, and I'm not a drinker.
yeah, get something.
So, thank you, I will be back.
Okay, we'll
All right.
see you in just a
I need a
bit.
cracker. I need a piece of bread.
I got a YouTube notification that you had already started live streaming.
Really?
Yeah, and I saw you. So I don't know if it's a time thing or if you were testing and something got activated.
I don't know how they decide.
I don't know if you're streaming now. You go look.
I don't know how they decide if that's what's happening or not.
Yeah.
I've actually never, I should ask,
What triggers it?
yeah, I should ask them how they decide on that, 'cause are either of you folks giving lightning talks this evening?
I'm not, no.
I left my shepherd's crook at home to drag people off after 15 minutes.
Yeah, see, this is what I was looking at before.
Just me standing up there fumbling around.
Yeah, you were just testing things that looked like, and
That's exactly what I want out on the internet.
yeah. It's a good thing you weren't having a private phone call or something at the time, so.
There may have been some muttered curses under my breath. I borrowed this I realized I needed, I can't believe I didn't think of this, but I needed to bring a laptop to plug into this thing tonight, and so I borrowed this one from work.
No.
And of course, I discovered once I got here that the thing is not, it won't let me change the network settings for some reason.
Oh, boy.
And
It's locked down somehow.
it's fine, it works out okay, because I put the presentation on a USB drive, but, so yeah, so I was standing up here muttering under my breath at this thing, so that was
Yeah.
just what the internet needs.
Is it worth doing a laptop check for those of us that are presenting?
Yes, sorry, I guess I asked them that just before you came in. Yeah,
Nice.
absolutely, I would. Do you have an HDMI output?
I have an HDMI adapter.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
they've got. So far, this setup has a spotless record, but you never know, you could be the first.
Well, now that you said that.
Yeah, no pressure.
Every time I think something is gonna go wrong, but they're really good about setting this stuff up. What is your name?
Hi, I'm Rachel Weil.
Rachel, I'm Ed. It's nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you.
Keith is not actually gonna make it tonight, so
Okay.
you're stuck with me.
No worries. That's the only person I know from the meetup. So,
Okay.
Yeah, he was actually the one that told me about it. I live here, but I didn't know about the API meetup until I ran into him and heard about it, so.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we're happy you found us somehow.
And you guys have been going for a while, right?
Yeah, let's see, I guess, early 2013, I think was when this started.
Amazing.
Oh, so you're kidding, it really isn't actually gonna work. That sounds
There we go.
promising.
Cool.
Oh, man.
Perfect.
Got score points already. That's awesome.
Cool.
Whose APIs are these? I'm sorry.
It's Microsoft.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And there is a Wi-Fi here.
There it
Call.
is.
Yeah, excellent, thank you.
Hey,
Hi.
how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Not too bad. Are you presenting tonight?
I am.
Okay,
Here,
well, I
I'll-
guess you're next in line to make sure all your gear works and the AV system
Okay.
here won't betray you.
Is there what's the,
You got something that is either HDMI
Yeah,
or they've got
this is it.
adapters for other stuff.
Is the API meetup?
You're in the right place.
Hey, I'm Tim.
I feel like we've met before.
I
so-
presented once here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And I'm presenting tonight.
Great. Okay, well, we got at least 4 people so far, so.
Looks like we have refreshments. Excuse me.
Yeah, there's some, it's live streaming. I'm now hearing conversation I had with Karen, who I met 5 minutes ago before she went downstairs to get some crackers. So, you may already be live streaming.
I'm gonna go ask him how he decided.
Um,
It's never occurred to me to ask before, and I never check.
Access code is not active, just heads up.
Oh, is it? Okay, well,
They
if
have
somebody
cards up
else,
there.
yeah, usually they leave 1 or 2 cards up there on the presentation, but if you just.
Yeah,
Podium,
yeah.
podium, but if you just ask that guy for, he'll hand them out to
Yeah, it
everybody.
used to be, yeah, they have cards, like business card size things, tokens.
Yeah, we still do that.
They still do that?
Yeah, that might be a card from last night or something. Don't know how people even change that.
sounds like it works.
I don't know, we have to do some sampling here and feed them into your cognitive services API.
What number did you get? Oh, yeah, they are unique.
Well, we don't know if they're unique, but, completely, but within some range.
Yeah.
So does Microsoft have offices here in town?
They do have one office here.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
Development? Or is it?
I don't know exactly who all is there. I
Yeah.
work from home mostly because
Oh, okay.
I travel a lot and there's no reason for me to be in the
Yeah.
office mostly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a little tiny office,
Hmm.
not too many people in there.
room is this on the airplay, do you know?
Classroom? Is that one of the options?
It's probably classroom.
I think this is the classroom. Not sure what that other one across the head is called.
Yeah. That's it.
curious about the GraphQL stuff. Like, do you see folks using that, you know, largely in just in a prototyping phase, or are they using that as essentially a replacement for all the normal query operations that they would do with the API, or is it an optimization for
Normally not
a
required
particular
for
set of clients?
You
You can also talk about that on the presentation.
Yeah, I'll address a lot of those things. It's a new metaphor for APIs, right? That is an alternative to REST. It has a lot of advantages. Definitely prime time. I mean, you can see on one of my slides, this is from about a year ago, Facebook serves about 3 billion requests through GraphQL per day.
Yeah,
No,
that's.
you can't. Wow, you confused.
So yeah, it's so I've built a production app. It's not in production yet, but
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
Just so
like,
quick.
it's not production ready, I just meant like, is it especially useful in, you know, before you kind of nail down exactly what it is you want to?
no, I don't think you would build
Are there supposed to be
GraphQL.
Yeah, there's all these tables.
Turn around and
I
build
just
a
really
REST.
don't have a place to set my server.
Okay.
They've got all the
Or something.
startup weeks like
Something like that. It's definitely an alternative way to expose an API. Another thing I'll mention, GitHub just announced they're rolling out a full GraphQL API.
Oh, that's pretty
Their
interesting.
service.
But in that case, it's not necessarily gonna replace existing APIs, it's just a.
I can't imagine that they would do that in the short term, just because I'm sure they have a lot of people dependent on
You have a
those
startup?
APIs, so.
No, no,
It's gotta be a parallel
I work for a
thing.
company, one of the larger companies that rents space here at Capital Factory.
Oh, okay.
But yeah,
I work for
we chose
Vinyard.
it for this, I'm working on
Probably
it as
never heard of
opposed
it.
to a REST type
Nope.
No one has this.
approach, and,
That's all right, nobody's heard
I
of my
mean, the
stuff.
one we're building is not necessarily even the clearest best
Well,
case
the problem is
for
my company's
it,
4,000
but,
people and 30 years old.
I like it, I
So-
mean, it's very,
Okay. You need some brain.
We're in long-term stealth mode.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it is. I'm just
Karen.
Is it still allowed to be called a
So to
startup
speak,
at 4,000 people at 30 years old?
Do you?
Well, I didn't say startup. I said
Oh,
stealth
Just
mode.
guess-
posted here, okay.
Yeah.
See,
Well,
when you're
do
in
you
the
know
comment like
if-
this, I just assume.
For example,
startup.
Facebook.
Yeah,
or
no,
there's
we have,
other folks who've
we
done
have an
this,
office
exposes
down
them to
on
large data
the
sets.
fifth floor.
Mm.
Cause we don't
Any
have
trouble
location
with
here in Austin, we're trying to get
potentially
one, we're trying
exposing
to start
very
one up.
expensive
But we don't
queries to
have
users
one
that
here,
way.
so right now
I
they're
guess
trying to
my,
rotate
this is just
people
from maybe
through,
paranoia
trying
speaking,
to
right,
get
like with a REST, with a
in-
REST API, I've
figure out
got a
what's going
pretty
on
tight
here in
handle
Austin
on what the
with the community.
performance characteristics of
The-
every query that I've exposed to my users is.
their initial reason for doing GraphQL
So what
was
do you
to
do?
improve
What's-
performance for a couple of reasons.
So, we
One
are,
is because, many
It's
views
hard to
require
explain.
a lot of.
we are a
retrieves,
digital
right?
communications company,
A view often
mostly a
needs,
telecom company.
Sure, okay.
But
needs
because
hierarchical
primarily on
projections
satellite
of data.
It's in
So,
the
rather
So-
than
I was like
have
sitting
multiple
here,
round
yes,
trips,
is it a satellite company?
Yeah, kind of.
you
The
can
thing is, we
almost
also
always
do
it in one,
other stuff
and
around
then,
communications as well, like we do
it also,
crypto work for the
you
military,
only
we have like half
request
of our
the data
business
that
is
you
defense
want.
contracting.
Right, so
Right.
you're not overloading or.
Yeah, basically our goal is to
Clogging
be the
up the
world's
pipe.
first
Yeah,
global
I
ISP.
guess it's kind of a tacit admission that
Okay.
your
Which should be kinda cool. you know?
client developers are gonna do whatever
So,
thing they were gonna do anyway, they're just.
Yeah, we are.
Right,
Right,
exactly.
In Boston.
Exactly,
and Denver.
They're just gonna do it with a whole bunch of requests instead of one.
Maryland
A small
and
one.
Cleveland.
It also,
But nothing here,
yeah, it
nothing
opens
in-
up
we're mostly a
opportunities for
product
for
and hardware company
optimization,
for a long time.
parallelism, things like that on the server. Like, you know, if I'm
Broadband internet.
doing a deep query, like
So you can get
something
internet
where I'm
service
getting
from
a
us
top level
at your
and
home,
then
at
a
your
set of
business.
children.
We do in-flight Wi-Fi for JetBlue, United, some Virgin American flights.
Rest, I mean,
We signed a
big
big
risk of an N
American,
plus
so we
one
haven't
type
been
situation
installed
is
yet.
pushed out to the client, so you can optimize for things like that. I mean, you know,
That's what we do.
Yeah,
I
that's
thi-
what
I
we-
think the answer is it's possible that you could.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess what you just said is really,
Here, what's that?
that resonates with me, right? Like, you know, I've written code against APIs
Most of our
that,
other offices have been acquisitions.
that was exactly
Companies
that,
that were
right?
doing interesting things, and we're like, hey,
Yeah.
we'll just go and
You
invite.
know, this is
And then
plus one, I don't see.
they all
do
kind of
this
get
against
morphed
their
into this
API. they're
just
not
another
necessarily
engineering
happy
office.
about
We try
that
to
long term.
avoid-
I'm not thrilled with it
Except in
right
certain
now.
cases, we try to avoid specialization, like we don't
if
want
that's
to
the
keep
only option I've got available.
all of our,
We do it anyway.
you know, network engineers in one
Yeah,
office.
exactly,
We want people to
exactly.
be percolating around,
You
learning
know,
from
I
each
mean-
other and all that kind of fun stuff.
You guys
Yeah,
have
I
any
mean,
interest
can
in
someone
that?
write one query that pulls up your whole database? I guess so. But yeah, they probably won't do that.
So.
I
Well,
mean,
I guess
yeah.
maybe your sort of resource usage limits have to change in that world if you have a.
It's replacing it with copper wires.
Yeah, you could certainly, I haven't seen anything built in that would do that, but you could certainly, build in constraints for that, for depth, maybe,
Or, I mean, if you really wanted to
And
be
there's a word for it.
strict, right, like you could essentially say, like, we're gonna
Well, I guess
limit
It's
the
like
amount of
eight
block time
crystal
you can
coated
use
on
of
the
our system.
tape. It's like, remember
Yeah.
those
Whatever resource constraints, you just can't count the
Like
number
we
of
saw that.
requests anymore.
Well, imagine that,
Yeah.
but with
That's not a good
metal.
measure. Maybe it was never a good measure, but it's
count the
definitely-
number of leaf nodes requested.
Ultra.
I don't know.
It's
It's gonna replace all the copper.
Yeah, but I think,
Is it
you know,
sorted or-
I'm not to the point in this room
It makes
dealing
it
with
look
any sort of publicly
I've
exposed
never heard of it.
APIs and dealing with
I mean,
those
There's a
kinds
couple
of
machine
concerns, so.
We've talked about doing something like that
Company there, what am I,
just for our
members of the
mobile
Austin
apps
Regional
because,
Manufacturers Association.
for that very reason, right? Instead of having to do a bunch of different round trip requests and trying to be clever about how to do those requests.
Really
and
neat stuff.
GraphQL
Really.
Come to you like 5 minutes after you get out of here,
Exactly.
you're walking back.
I mean, that's one.
If only we had a handheld device that had all the world's knowledge and information.
It was
Only
built
if
for
only.
that,
If
and
only.
then
They
it
did money
just
for that.
sort of
Yeah.
took over.
No, it was really neat to go through their facility and see that big, huge thing they built to essentially, you know, build this tape. Yeah, very winding up. Can't remember. But essentially, you should buy them. They're doing pretty cool stuff. Yeah, I have a startup, that's why I'm here, learning about APIs.
What is your sir?
It's a profile site
Okay.
that has a e-commerce aspect to it, so essentially it's, I'm building a third profile.
Okay.
Right now you have a social profile, you have a professional profile, to be building your e-com, which right now is your, credit score.
Right.
But you don't control that.
Correct.
So I'm the one to be controlled and get rewarded. Rental and share your money. Every time you take a picture.
Interesting.
I sit in the middle of that, there's build. And run the rest of your time.
Okay.
If you choose. I'm using retailers and APIs. That's my opinion.
Right. The you choose aspect of it seems like it would be less useful for retailers, so if they want to know,
Well-
if you do get to handpick things, then that might be it.
It's the aspect that, you choose to be on, you choose to be on Facebook, you choose to be on
True.
LinkedIn, so that's the you choose. It's not that you are required to be like Craigslist
Sure.
to be on it. And it means that you have less risk of having a negative presence on the area. For this particular area.
I don't know, maybe it's like about
Some people would consider this to get, but it's objective, it's subjective, and it's quantifiable. The rest is just sort of, it's a small, yeah, he's a good guy.
I met him at a meetup once, he seemed all right.
You know, and it's not siloed inside of Airbnb.
Right.
Uber. It's in the middle, shared amongst all of them. Very cool. So you can gain value out of all of that life. That's what we're doing. Well, we built it, we just.
Yeah.
Right.
How many merchants do you have to hook up to then? Or do you have like a few
Oh,
ones?
Well, right now, what I need to do is get the first ones from like the Shopify and Amazon, you know, the people that do a lot more. Once I scale up and I can geo map, then I can do a local.
Is there anybody here from Open Austin? Nobody that's willing to admit it? Okay, so we got Tim, David?
I'm Adam.
Adam, sorry.
No, no problem.
Is David?
That would be me.
Oh, great, okay. Do you have stuff you wanna test out here before we get started?
Am I gonna go first?
No, well, I was gonna ask you guys, maybe if you're gonna present, if you'll come up here and huddle with me for just a minute. We'll kind
Yeah.
of figure that out.
I do have a small presentation.
Yeah, great. Just, tempt the demo god, that's on you.
Yes.
So you guys all a local TPU distributor. Cool.
This is the one you want, right?
Not my work. That's like,
Yeah.
they don't have HDMI?
They do, yeah.
Oh, I have one over here.
Rachel, Adam, and Tim. I'm gonna get that, I'm sorry. If you guys will come up here for just a second, sort this out. I don't really care what order we go in.
Well, that works for me.
It looks like it's just the five of us. Mine's pretty boring, so if you guys take the whole time, it'll kill me. So since there are fewer of us,
Now, he's like, all right, I got
if we
two
start
young kids, my wife
10
was
minutes
ready
or
to
so,
go afford a house I actually buy. So they
I don't wanna
moved
cut
down to San
a
Diego.
little short if I don't have to,
Magically
so
afforded
it's
more and more
15 minutes, once you run up to 20 minutes or something.
He's got some crazy
You know,
stories.
get to actually- I mean,
I'm probably gonna be racing to do 15, so
Okay.
if I can get 5 more, that'd be.
Yeah, if you don't,
Alright.
you have to stay up, because mine is definitely not gonna make 20 minutes. You guys have any preference about order? Anybody need to leave early or anything like that?
And my talk is flexible, I can make it longer. I think it's probably gonna be in the 10-minute range, but I can make it longer, so if you want me to
Okay.
go to the end and I can adjust
You
based
just fill
on-
space at the.
Or, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, maybe.
But I don't have any strong preference.
Yeah, let's.
I'll definitely
let's-
be 10 to 15 minutes.
Let's do that, and, okay, so I tell you what, so you guys, maybe you go first, since you're saying that yours is relatively short, and
Pretty short.
then it's depending on time, right?
Yeah.
If we get towards the end there and it looks like we got lots of time, then I'll try to get through mine real quick and then you can go, and if we're running out of time, then I'll just turn it over to you and you can run out the clock. I will try to, I will give you like a warning in about 15 minutes, just so you know, and then definitely wanna kind of wrap things up 15 or 20 to 9, so that we have a little time to socialize, and then I have some time to clean up before they chase me around. So, that sound good? All right, so first,
I guess I'd prefer to go earlier.
okay, first,
All right.
second, third, then, yeah, fourth or fifth, depending on how much time we got.
3%?
Yeah, I've got something, but I'm flexible. I would rather you guys get to talk. If it's at the expense of me doing it, that's fine.
Okay, what's your name?
Ed Vinyard.
Nice to meet you.
We can come back and chat.
I'm David.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
All right, how about you?
I got the wrong row.
Oh, building a single sign-on surveys for one thing, and then,
So we,
on a bit of a rush time schedule with the building out, well, help being used slightly in building out an API for another client that all functionality was there, and just no API in place. So.
This beats the alternative, right?
Yeah.
Functionality there, no?
It is an older application, with, like, business line. Me and two other guys on the back end, one guy on the front end, one guy
So my
on
team,
the
build
interface.
assets of it, make sure that it's global.
Thing that uses an IE web. So,
It's something I would.
we have to integrate with this party that has Windows applications integrated with common base. So we have a little Windows DLL that goes through methods that needs, and then immediately turns around and says, hey, WebView, we're going to throw React app in here against you, and then of course that communicates with the apps. It's like, let's do as little as we possibly can outside the browser. Yeah.
Okay.
We got that working, and now the person who built that's like, okay, if we need to do something else about it, then we can. But something else is going to be, okay, Paul comes in, immediately gets dispatched to a method on the window of what view. So, works out. That would be like going up to Seattle for a conference.
Which one?
Pacific Northwest PHP. So,
Is that actually in Seattle?
I did see your.
it is, no, it's smaller, but, this time they had it at, the Cornish Theater.
Also,
which
thank you for
is,
letting me know that I, like, it's,
you
that's
could
obviously a copy
Facebook
paste
from-
error.
yeah,
so
Facebook
on my
from it.
part.
So.
No CMS, it's just all.
That's all
it's
can.
Our standard.
Is there any like complex of buildings at
Yeah, I mean, it's in that same kind of green space.
music project and all that stuff there?
If it's not in that complex of buildings, it's really close.
I worked up there, I don't know,
Okay.
9 years or something, so I work downtown, but
Mhm.
occasionally when I'm up there.
Yeah.
This is the right time to do it, I guess.
Yeah, it was sunny for basically all of the time that we were there.
You got like one of the 2 weeks of the year.
Yeah, it was great, and then, Monday. Hard.
I would genuinely be, like, feel guilty, like, during those 2 weeks, when I would be, like, getting off us working, because I was like, this is it, you know, like after this, you're back in the tunnel until, you know, March or April.
Yeah.
I really ought to go outside and not just be sitting inside.
Yep. Okay. I mean, another couple of projects, one is API rewrite because the company that, so it's something that got built using Spring, and they don't actually have any folks with enough bandwidth and expertise to really maintain it, and the person who built it left. So it's like, okay, we need to port this over now rather than later.
That's terrible. Hate stuff like that.
But I mean, it's like, okay, well, I'll pick this apart, and you've got
where you work.
what it's supposed to do.
Where do you work? What do you do?
I work at a huge deal. Allogy. We're actually a small company.
And it's fun, but.
Okay, so they have other developers, they just don't have any other.
Is it like a startup or?
Yeah, more or less.
We've been around
And
for
they've
5
got,
years.
Okay.
well, they
But-
don't have
You know, we don't
enough
take any
Java
investment.
in general dev, not counting Android,
We mostly built that through
to
Yeah,
maintain a
like,
different
trick on these Android
various R&D projects that take up.
So you're like professional services and consulting kind of stuff? or
I think
you have a project?
Yeah,
they're,
sort of, kind of both. We
I
have.
mean, they've got Java devs, but they're all on like random
slowly
projects,
building.
and
It's really
they're,
rough, I think. to build
their
projects.
own in-house dev teams are primarily PHP, so that's why I'm
So,
like, okay,
we
well,
make most of
Yeah,
the
it's hard to be a
professional
professional
services.
services and
Yeah.
product company at the
Then-
same time.
Yeah,
in theory, they'll have no
but
problem maintaining.
it's actually a lot of fun, so
So,
I enjoy it.
What's the specialty or what's the focus of the
I hope
company?
not.
So, probably say learning would be.
It's not that big of
So, our
an
founder
API, so it's not
is
that big of a
really
deal that
fond of
it has to be
learning.
rewritten, but it's not
Wants to
very.
encourage
We have one-
more
we
like
have one
mentor
tour
to
that-
try to make self facilitate that.
Somebody did a long time ago.
And we also deal a bit in the healthcare space. So we've done a number of
Right.
apps, or
It's just, like, no, there's no way.
yeah, apps that.
It's the redheaded stepchild language, and that can
you
happen.
guys build custom.
Luckily,
Yeah,
it's
we've
it's
got
fairly
these
small, we really
and then
did actually need to change it.
we're working on this learning
Right.
framework.
Yeah.
It was one of those things
Using
where I think
that
at the time,
as
it
more
was like, really quick.
Yeah.
I don't think it's-
Do you have a specialty as far as
And now, everybody else is just like.
We mostly focus on
It's not like learning a language
Yeah.
to change things. It's like it would be faster to We
And
read
then-
it and learned.
But you're talking for backend, and
So
then
it's
Which,
just not gonna touch
it's
it.
like, on the one hand, supposedly, if you're doing a.
Yeah, what about you?
service architecture, then
Well, I've
you have to
been,
be okay, right, in the
um,
language that.
for many years,
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
more
Interface
on
that
and
makes
off,
sense, and if you don't-
independent contractor.
If you don't wanna do it in
I've
that
sort of
language
done some
later
side
on, then
projects in
rewrite
my
the entire
own
thing, that's fine.
startup, and
Yeah, I guess so.
never
I mean,
quite,
it would be
never
nice if
quite
it didn't have
got
to
that
be,
going,
right?
but, I've got a side project that's
If you
kind of still
could,
going,
if you could at
but,
least.
yeah, mostly
If you at
contracting,
least have,
and,
you know.
did .NET for many years, and then
Oh, yeah.
kind of shifted to Ruby on Rails, and then,
Well, you know, I know we've got enough people.
right now I'm building a Node.js server app, with, React Web, React Native for
And I think we just did it as the time
Okay.
play because.
yeah, so I'm always been kind of a full stack
Yeah.
Image magic, right? So,
yeah, so,
all right.
so it's the whole React scene is pretty interesting, that's what kind of pulled me into GraphQL, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I've had a chance to use React.
All right, guys. This evening we're doing lightning talks, so I'm not going to talk very much at you, and we will just jump right into this. Keith could make it this evening. I'm at Vinyard, for those of you who haven't been here before. Actually, how many of you have been to a meetup before, one of these meetups before? Oh, that kind of the back there is lying. I don't think
Yeah,
I've
I've
ever
never
seen
been
it.
here.
For how many of you is this your first API meetup? Welcome. We're happy to have you. Hope we see you again. Hope we can convince you that it's worth coming back. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first lightning talk presentation of the evening. I'll give you a warning if you make it to 15 minutes.
Okay.
We've got a little bit of extra time because one of our presentations dropped out at the last minute. So feel free to ask questions and stuff. They're gonna run a little bit longer than they might have otherwise.
Hey, I'm Adam, and I started a company called Rebilly, and we do subscription billing automation. And one of the problems that we hit when we were crafting our product was actually there weren't a lot of standards in terms of API specifications. And then after so we kind of crafted our own, and that ended up being difficult to maintain. And some common standards evolved. Does anybody here use Swagger or Open API Spec? Okay. So we ended up moving to Swagger. We had seen it in its previous version, but it didn't meet our needs, so we had glossed over it when we were doing our initial search. But 2.0 ended up meeting most of our use cases. Not all, but most. So we decided to adopt it, and one of the things that we were looking at was sort of how we could use this spec in a whole bunch of pieces in our API lifecycle. And this lightning talk is about how we use it for developer documentation. So the developer docs are the docs that one of our clients' developers would go to figure out how to use our API, or someone from our front-end team might go to figure out how to use our API. So one of the complications we ran into is that there's lots of tools out there for Swagger, lots of tools. Some not compatible with the current spec, some just partially compatible with it. And the main tool for building something that looks kind of like developer docs is called Swagger UI. Well, we were kind of excited about that because it was one less piece of work that we had to duplicate. We tried to give Swagger UI we gave it a shot, and it just didn't work at all for us. So our API consists, a lot of our request bodies are JSON objects, and those and sometimes nested objects. And Swagger UI does not render that at all. So you'll end up with a spec, if you specify your Swagger properly, you end up with Swagger UI rendering just that the API request takes a body. And you're like, oh, I specified everything that's in the body, but it's not displaying on the documentation, so this isn't going to work. So we've investigated. Also, the UI itself looked a little bit dated, but we were sure that we could skin that how we liked. We did some investigation, and we found a couple tools. We found someone who really did a lot of surgery on Swagger UI, but they used some kind of code automation, and we weren't going to be able to modify their project. So we spoke with the Swagger team to see if they would be interested in us contributing to expand their Swagger UI to support, proper rendering of a JSON body in the documentation. And they didn't really see eye to eye with us on that. So we decided to build our own, and that's how ReDoc was born. So ReDoc, it's an open source project that we started. We launched version 1 at the end of July. It's got the widest support of the Open API features. Has anybody here heard of ReDoc? Just out of... All right. That's kind of amazing. And it's got the docs, the way that it handles nested objects is pretty neat. It even has support for discriminators. I don't know if anybody here is using discriminators or knows what those are. Anybody? All right. So I'll demo a discriminator in a moment. Who's using it? Well, we just launched, but surprisingly or not surprisingly, a lot of people have this same problem that we had, which is they've got a request object that's not really being rendered well, or a response object that's not being rendered well. And so we've noticed some big companies already adopting ReDoc, at least internally. Getting started, I am very impatient, so I needed something that's really, and I'm not very skilled, so I needed something that was really simple to get started. And sometimes we'll have a situation where we've got an opportunity and we have to propose an API spec for a potential client or partner, and we kind of have to do that pretty quickly. So I wanted something where I could just create a new repo that would make my spec look pretty, so that I could collaborate on the spec with our partner and end up with something nice. So that's what this generator of the Open API repo. It generates the contents of a repo, and it also sets up a Travis YAML file. And if you connect your repo to Travis, it will validate your spec every time you commit and publish it on GitHub pages. Well, now I'll show you a couple things. I'm the king of tabs, so this is pretty good. I only have about 10 tabs open. So here is the Swagger pet store, which you may be familiar with. It's generally the Swagger sample API, which is just a silly API, and we've made modifications to it to demonstrate some of the functionality. So this request is, well, one of the things you'll notice first is that it's got a more modern 3-panel design. It's responsive, so I could collapse this and it will load on a mobile as well. But you'll notice that this request, unlike the Swagger UI is using a JSON body, and we've got this little sample here. But we're also demonstrating the discriminator here. So what you'll notice here is if I change the type of pet from dog to cat, this bottom field here, hunting skill, just appeared. And if I change it back to dog, you're going to see it's going to change to pack size. So a lot of times when I'm using other APIs, you'll come across this documentation, which is you know, a little bit strange, where you'll have field descriptions like pack size only required when the pet type is a dog, and that's all sort of described in the description of the field instead of in the specification. So that's one of the nice, yeah?
I'm confused. Would you take your cat hunting as opposed to a dog?
Our developer would. For sure. Yeah, it's a wild cat. He's got a really large cat. So
If you're hunting
yeah,
mice.
I'd say, yeah. But they've also got different hunting skill levels. So, you know, it could be a clueless cat. So you can define these in your Swagger spec as well. If a field has a specific range of values, you can define that. So this is a very simple specification, and all of this is generated from the Swagger. I don't know the location on that one. So here we're just demonstrating pulling in another Swagger file. This is a Swagger YAML file that's being parsed of part of Instagram's API. So if someone also provides you with a Swagger JSON file or YAML file, you can use this and just paste a URL in there and explore the API in a more readable way, more human readable way. This was the YAML. Here is a quick example of a feature that we're working on in our API. So we're working on a coupons and discounts feature, and this one of the aspects is I was going to demonstrate this discriminator again. As a discriminator, we've got a couple concepts. A simple one is that a discount can have a type, and the type can be fixed or % discount. And if we notice here, when the type is fixed, we're expecting an amount in a currency, and when the type is a %, we're only expecting a value because there's no currency related to a % discount. So little things like that. Of course, it's expandable. This, using the quick the Travis CI that we file that we generate from the generator, this builds. This is in the coupons draft branch, and in our spec here, and in any spec, if you're using that, if you go to preview slash the branch name, it will render that that branch's version of the spec. So it makes it easier for doing spec code reviews sometimes, and also catches things because sometimes the spec may be valid, but it might still be improper. So if something, you know, it may be valid and it may look valid, but when you look at the rendered, the human rendered version of it, you may notice that, oh wait, that was supposed to be at a different level, or that, you know, just didn't make sense. It got moved to a different spot, and can adjust that. one of the other sort of tools or tricks that we like to do, and you may have noticed it a little bit from this one, but I'll just dive into some of our API here, is the organization of of your API. Depending on how large your API is, you probably want to break it up into separate files, or else everybody's working on this one big swagger.json or YAML file. And we decided to use YAML because we thought it was a little bit more readable. And ReDoc takes care of the translation, well, thanks to some libraries that we use. And so if we drill into it, we generally organize our repos into these three folders: code samples, definitions, and paths. And ReDoc is using a Swagger extension to render the code samples. And so the paths are written in, we make a separate file per path, and the @ symbol represents what would be a slash in the URI. So the ID in the brackets would represent this parameter, which would be in the URI. And this spec will reference other objects, so that it makes it so. Here's the schema of this particular endpoint that is defined here, and then we've got that folder for definitions. And we found that, well, originally we were putting all our definitions to one folder, but it made more sense to group them by context. So we could drill into a specific context and have all of those definitions in that context together. Makes it read better, make more sense to someone who's new and trying to jump into and learn your API. So that's it. Any questions? Yes?
So the examples panel, the third one?
Yeah.
That's, statically prepared by who's ever specifying the API, right?
No, actually those are, so there's two, so this request samples, for example, this is just prepared based off of each, the specification of the data. So how is it, what's the field type? Is it a string or in Swagger you could specify something as being sort of a date time string, and if it is, then that's how it sort of,
it's auto-generating.
so it's just, yeah, it's just auto-generating. Now, we haven't taken the time to do some code samples, but in the pet store, I think we've demonstrated some samples, and these you can highlight over here. So if you want, you could create code samples. If you have an SDK, you could put something together like that and put those samples there.
And follow up, is there any value, do you think, to letting the user of this specification or document, if you're documenting a site that's up, an API that's up and running, to let the user who's exploring this API to actually put in some of their own data and issue the request to see what comes back?
Yeah,
is there any value to that? I mean, I can understand if you see sample data, it's like, okay, I've wrapped my head around it.
Yeah.
Next, but
now you want to try a sample request. Yeah, so that we would call like a client. And Swagger UI, that's what Swagger UI is, the developer documents and a client rolled into one. So you can make requests through it. The client, we're looking at adding that as a next sort of major feature. But there are a lot of little things that still need to be added, and part of it is dependent on the next version of the Swagger spec itself. So Swagger doesn't really have native support for environments. We've got a sandbox and a live API, and the endpoints are different for those. And it would be, we've seen some people post and issues in GitHub for us, how they're hacking their way around those environments, but Swagger is likely to support that in the next version, so we would probably, integrate that when that's done. But our focus primarily is first on the proper rendering of the specs, and there's parts of specs that we're not doing properly, and some sort of gotchas, so like file uploads, stuff like that. It's not rendering properly. Last time I checked, it might now. Security definitions, it's not really rendered at all. We work our way around that by adding some markdown text to our Swagger definition, which explains our security model. And I think those are the two big things off the top of my head. If you've used ReDoc, is there anything that pops out to you that's missing?
I mean, the stuff that's missing in it is stuff that's missing in Swagger, not so much the ReDoc, really.
Right.
Swagger 2 has limitations that you're well aware of, and we're hoping that Swagger 3 will fix those.
Yeah, and there are a lot of gotchas, like you can't use JSON schema completely. So if you think, oh yeah, this is how we're going to describe this, and you get excited about it, but then Swagger may not support your ideas. And sometimes you need extensions to do things like, but ReDoc supports some of the common ones like X-nullable. So if you have a field that may be nullable, Swagger spec doesn't really like that. Like if you declare a field as a string, they want it to be a string. They don't want it to be string or null. It can be optional, but that means like don't return the field at all, but it can't be, so little things like that. But we support a couple of those common extensions, but this is it's very much a work in progress, and we're continuing to invest in it, and we'd love to get more user feedback if anybody wants to give it a shot. We hope that it makes your API specification writing and reading a little bit easier. Yeah?
So how big is the Rebilly team here in Austin?
We're 2 here in Austin.
2?
Yeah.
Up at, North Capitol, Texas?
Yeah. And the 2 that worked on this, well, this was my, this was kind of my baby, but the 2 guys that I found that work on it, they work out of Ukraine. It's a guy, Ivan and Roman. So I don't know if you know them, but they're good, really good guys. They're only working on this part-time, but it's, I think they've done a great job with it.
And they developed a product called API's Guru, which is a Swagger, what would you call it, like directory. Like
yeah, so
it's
if you guys have an API and it's for the public to consume, you should submit it to the API gurus, because it's a platform for other people to discover your API.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Give you a warning about 15 minutes, and we're doing fine on time.
Sure, sounds good.
Hi, my name's Tim Scott. I'm an independent developer, and really excited about GraphQL, which is really kind of a whole, hate to use this cheesy term, but a new paradigm or a paradigm shift in the concept of APIs. Just getting close to launch of an app that I've been working on that is it's a Node.js server with a React web front end and a React Native app targeting Android first. So we made the choice to, instead of using a RESTful API, to use GraphQL. So I wanted to tell you what I've learned about that. First, who knows what GraphQL, who's heard of GraphQL? Who would say they have a pretty good idea what it is? Okay, not many people. All right, well, I'll try to change that today. So GraphQL is a query language for your API and a server-side runtime using a type system that you define. And it's been developed by Facebook. So let's talk a little bit about the origins and birth of GraphQL at Facebook. So, excuse me, back around 2011, you'll probably remember that Facebook kind of made a heavy move into mobile. They started pretty much as a desktop-based company, and they had some pretty good infrastructure for throwing out HTML, so they went mobile browser first. They made a big bet on that, and by about 2012, they decided that that was not really the way to go because more features were being added to the native experience in mobile. So they made a hard turn. Made a hard turn around 2012-ish into native. And of course, for that, they needed to be serving data, not HTML strings, right? So they had some RESTful APIs that they leveraged, and they built upon those. But before long, you're probably aware that Facebook, has a lot of users, a lot of transactions. So they really got to a place where they're having some serious pain and seeing the limitations of REST as a kind of a metaphor for APIs. So what were some of those pains? It really centered around, again, they were using this really mainly just for mobile, and it was really in a sort of a corner of the company. They started really having difficulties with performance around multiple round trips. So for a particular view in a mobile app, they found that they'd have to get a root object and then maybe make multiple additional calls to get the rest of the information to populate that view. And so multiple round trips takes time, and also there's a multiplicative chance that something will be dropped along the way, and they won't have the user will have a bad experience with the more round trips that happen. The other problem that they faced is that the shapes of the data that they're getting back through RESTful APIs aren't exactly what the views need, right? And so over time, data served from various resources from REST calls end up being overloaded because they have multiple clients or maybe multiple views within the same client that need different projections of a user or a friend or a share or a like, whatever the model is that they're pulling back. You don't need exactly the same fields or the same projection of data in every view, and so you end up just putting more and more fields onto each request, and so you end up moving a lot of data back and forth that you don't need. So, you either deal with that or you have more and more types of resources that are tailored to certain types of views, and so you have this ever-enlarging, expanding API with, again, more and more fields or more and more different types of requests. And they also found that this created a lot of coupling. The clients, meaning their mobile apps at this point, have to know a lot about the RESTful API. They have to know, exactly how to make a request, what the parameters need to be, and they need to also deal with the fact that if a mobile app or a client front-end experience needs additional features on the API, well, that's going to be a different engineer. And so as they develop the client, they found it was taxing on their back-end engineers to keep up. And then, of course, we all, if you deal with APIs, you know that there's a lot of challenges with versioning and keeping everything together there. So they created, again, kind of in a sort of a, I don't know if it's quite a skunk works, but it's sort of a small corner of the company working on their mobile apps. They created this thing called GraphQL. And they realized as they went that it was really a mind shift from resources to a graph. So thinking about data not as individual resources, but more of a hierarchical graph of information that views need. And so what they developed is a language to declare a schema, as well as queries, meaning ways to get to that schema in certain ways, and also mutations, because GraphQL is a read-write type of a system as well. It's not just querying data, it's changing it as well. So the first thing you'll notice when you deal with GraphQL is you don't have a whole bunch of routes. You have one endpoint that, it can be a get, but like just basically one URL that kind of harkening back to the bad old days of SOAP, maybe. This is an articulation of a type. User has an ID, which is an integer, name, which is a string, occupation, and then an array of strings, call them interests. Just one example of what a type might look like. So this is what a query might look like. So now we're getting into the GraphQL actual query language. So imagine I'm connected to, or I'm logged into a system, so it has the concept of me, and I can say, give me my name and occupation. So when I run that, I'll get back something like this. And so you'll notice on the left is GraphQL, on the right is JSON. And the thing that you'll notice is that it's a parallel structure, so that the front-end developer who created this query knows pretty well exactly by looking at the query exactly what they're going to get back. So there's no need to look at documentation necessarily about that. Yes?
You said that you were logged in a system. Do you mean that you have to have a session that's maintained to use GraphQL?
No, not necessarily. I'm just saying if there's a concept of me, that implies that I'm logged in. So this could be user with a parameter of ID, for instance. In fact, you'll see that in just a second. So now let's look at a simple mutation. Let's say I want to change my job. So what this shows us is that, so we have a mutation here, and we're declaring the signature of that mutation, which is that it's going to require an input field of job, which is string, and that the bang there indicates it's required. And then me is an alias. That's what I want to get back, but I want to call the method change job and pass in the job, and then return back a projection of ID and occupation. And so when I run that, I need to pass in some variables. So I'd like to change jobs. If you know me, you know I've always wanted to be a lion tamer. So I run that, and here's the result. So I've now changed my job on the server. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the Star Wars API, which you may have heard of or be familiar with, which is a REST API playground. So Facebook took this tool which they created called Graphical. Oops. Let's see. Called Graphical. Oh, shoot, now I can't see it. I need to figure out how to do mirroring. Okay. So this is just a web page, GraphQL, Swappy, parseapp.com. So one of the interesting things about GraphQL is because you've declared the schema of your information on the server, there's some special queries that automatically exposes that gives any client full documentation that's always correct and up to date. So that allows this panel here to allow me to navigate through my documentation, but this tool...
Anyway, you can bump the font, sorry.
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
How's that?
Yeah, much better.
So we can see that there's the root, and here are the queries, all films, which is of type film connection, which has all these things, etc. So you can drill down. So I can drill down through the entire graph and see the entire specification of everything that's available on a server. And this is pulling right from code. This is not something that someone has to create as documentation. Now there is metadata that you can enter, such as type, description annotations and names and things like that, that can enhance this. But this is coming straight from my declarative code that defines my API itself. And because we've got that, this tool is pretty awesome in the sense that it has auto completion. It knows exactly what's available. So I'm going to say all films, and then let's just say we just want to know the total count. So there's 6 Star Wars films, but we also want to see the actual films. Now one thing you'll notice is that GraphQL projections are always scalar leaf nodes. So there's no concept that you will return some sort of complex type without saying what you actually want. So I can't just say, give me all the films. I have to say, what do I want to know about films? So title, that's a scalar kind of end leaf node. So I can get all the titles of the films. And again, I can get various information, and then I've got my JSON over here on the right, which is exactly what you expect. There's an interesting paradigm that's used where there's all films and then total count, and then this will also support things like pagination, so I can do like pagination and keep track. I'm not going to get into that, that's too in depth for this. I can say I just want the first 2 films. Okay, and I can say, let's get this ID here. So let's say I just want the ID of that, I just want that film. So I'm going to say film ID. Again, I need to say what I want about the film. Okay, you get the idea. Very powerful. So what's so great about GraphQL? This kind of goes back to some of the pain points that Facebook was facing with REST. You can get the exact shape of information you want for a particular view in one call, or you should be able to in most cases. Because the query shape is pretty much parallel to the result shape, it's very intuitive for front-end developers to know what they're getting based on what they're asking for. This allows all kinds of performance optimizations, not just the fact of multiple round trips and not just skinnying down the projection to be just the data that I want, but because I'm asking for a deeper graph, the server can do things like fetch things in parallel, or maybe do a one-shot query to avoid kind of N+1 problems. It provides opportunities for the server developer to make things very fast. Self-documenting, always current. As you saw with graphical, having sort of full introspection allows IDE type support like the autocomplete, validation like the little red squiggly, and can even do code generation in theory. I haven't seen anything that does that yet. And the biggest advantage, I think, is that access patterns change much faster and more frequently than do schemas. So the way I define my world of information, and even, you know, kind of the security or other aspects like that that need to be addressed in GraphQL, change a lot less frequently than the access patterns. So when you have a RESTful API with a lot of different calls returning specific projection, you know, predefined projections, the changes in access patterns of clients are going to push you to have to change your server a lot more frequently. And so this kind of slows the pace of it. It makes the client be able to evolve more independently, more easily from the server. So GraphQL, I guess they started on it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it's very mature. As of, this is about a year ago, Facebook was serving 3 billion requests per day in GraphQL. This just was last week. I think GitHub has announced they're creating a complete GraphQL version of their API. There's server support for most languages. I've used both Node and Ruby. There's a library called Relay, which is a way of using GraphQL with React components, and it handles pagination and things like that nicely. We didn't use Relay in the app that I'm developing. It was just sort of one too many things to digest. Things are emerging. There's this company called Reindex, which is sort of think of parse for GraphQL. So I don't know anything about this company. I've just read their homepage, but they tout that you can get your GraphQL server up, you know, in a day or whatever without any coding. There's, you know, more and more tools for client support. You saw the graphical tool, which is a Facebook created and maintained tool. There's a company called Apollo that has a sort of a suite of client stuff. Again, I don't know a lot about them, but you're just seeing a lot of activity in that area. And that's it. Questions?
Yeah. How do you handle like permission or scope so that someone can't access some other person's data?
Sure. So I'll tell you how we're doing it. There may be better or more canonical or more baked in ways to do it, but when you create a query on your server, you essentially say, here are the arguments it takes, here's what it returns, and then you have a pure function called a resolver. And so for us, that resolver always takes the arguments plus the current user context. So we always have the user ID, and we just handle it there. So what we're doing is just saying, sorry, you're not entitled to this at the you know, most
So
per request.
So there's a layer that's in between the GraphQL server and the client, and that's the server that's injecting that resolver?
No, so the resolver is the kind of the implementation of the query.
Okay.
So when I say film ID blah blah blah, that eventually is hitting a piece of code on my server that says film query, or it just says film because it's the name of the query on the server is the same as what I provide GraphQL, and then it has a function called resolver that takes the ID. And I'm passing in user context. So if that user, you know, let's say it's a user profile that you're asking for. Are you the user who's asking for that profile? No, I send back a 401.
Okay.
Or I throw an exception maybe from there, unauthorized, and then my web layer turns that into a 401. You know, I'm sure when you get into public APIs and stuff, it gets a little more complicated because I may have a top level query that 3 levels down I'm asking for something I'm not entitled to, and maybe the way the server should behave is just not send me that. That's where it might get a little trickier, and I haven't tackled that yet, but it's all your code that handles that, so.
So you got one endpoint, okay, and is there any, and there's a resolver, it sounds like functions or adapters. Now, can the backend data store be anything, like a NoSQL database, an SQL database? Does it really matter?
Could
If
be
your
a-
resolver can basically take that descriptor and do whatever, it's like compiling an SQL query. It could,
So what you saw with that Star Wars API, that is literally, in fact, I stole a whole bunch of stuff from this guy, Lee Byron, who's a Facebook engineer that was one of the key people developing it, and that is actually a great video to watch. And he shows that he's using that Star Wars API, and he's got a terminal window in the background and showing it hit the actual REST API. So the parse app is nothing but a shim over the GraphQL API. In fact, he kind of suggests that's a way to move to GraphQL, is just shim it over top of your REST API. Maybe just to test it out or prototype it maybe. But yeah, it could be anything. It could be hitting other microservices. It could be assembling data from different sources. Yeah, it's 100% your code. Where you might think of having controllers, right? That's what your resolvers are doing.
Do you have any idea how it's self-documenting if it doesn't know like what the database is or that it's working with? Like how does it know what fields it can go after?
Because I've declaratively described my API. Let's see if I can do this real quick. There's a special query that is exposed here called schema. And so let's see, types, name. So let's just run that. So these are all the types in this system. And so you can go down from there. It's because, again, in my code, I've declaratively described all my types, my queries, and mutations. And so there's this special schema query. There's another one called type, where if I just want to interrogate one type and see everything about it, it's just another GraphQL query to get that information. And that's what this graphical, that's what it does. When I refresh this page, the first thing that it does is it runs this schema query. We could open up the inspector and see the actual GraphQL that it runs, and that populates this pane here. Yes.
The benefits here on the query side seem really obvious. You gave a little example with the mutator. Can you speak to how, like what advantages you see of using this for altering the data on the server side here, as opposed to, it doesn't seem like there's as much of a benefit here compared to a normal RESTful API, but maybe I'm missing some.
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, because
I guess it depends on access patterns a little too, but.
Yeah, and a mutation can be anything that you want. It doesn't have to be expressed in the semantics of a resource. It could be, do XYZ and pass in the data, and you've exposed that as a. So yeah, it's a little, maybe a little less powerful, but they wanted you to be able to create one API that handles all the needs of a client.
Since you're talking about one endpoint, how do you handle versions of nodes that may be there in your data structure?
Say that again.
How do you handle versions, different versions, if you have to manifest that in a single endpoint in a hierarchy?
Yeah, I noticed here that, where is it? No, I'm sorry. If I hack around here enough, and find it in the schema, I'm going to see information about deprecations. So and I don't think that's necessarily built into GraphQL, but in this API they've built in information into the schema that may say this field is being deprecated. And then in the next release will be gone. So it's not different than any other version, when you have code that changes and you have other systems dependent on it, you have to have a way to deprecate and notify. To be honest with you, I haven't thought very deeply about, I'm in the wonderful days of not having to worry about that stuff yet. But I think it's a little simpler because you're dealing with it at a more fine-grained level rather than saying, this call goes away or there's a whole new version that's published on this date. I don't know. I probably need to think a little more deeply about how versioning works in this world.
Thanks very much.
Thank y'all.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm David Venable. I'm the CTO at Allogy. We do mobile and cloud development. So several months ago, I was at one of these meetups, and Tim Scott, who we just heard present on GraphQL, gave a presentation called "It's All About Dembots," as it was called. And so what he did was he created a simple Slack chatbot right in front of our eyes. And honestly, I was really inspired. So I went home, and I decided I wanted to make some sort of Slack tool. On my drive home, I was thinking, what could I make? I thought, well, I'll make a simple tool to check on some server health status and grab some of that. Now, at the same time, in the back of my mind, I've been thinking of using a tool that AWS provides called API Gateway. This is a tool that's the tool I'm going to talk about. It'll let us deploy code to the cloud without having any servers. So I went home, I wrote a Slack/command, and I wrote it in Python, deployed it to AWS, and it started running there without any servers. And what I think is really the best part about it is that it still runs to this day, even though I don't maintain that thing. So I'm going to talk first about AWS Lambda, which is part of this solution. So AWS Lambda is, I think, where most of the magic for this system happens. Probably many of y'all have heard of this, but what you can do is you can upload some code to Lambda. Natively, they support Java, Python, and Node. So for Java, you would upload a jar file, and then if you have Python or Node.js, you can just upload a script. So just give them a text file. And what I think is really amazing is that the code just runs whenever you need it. And you don't know where it runs, it just runs somewhere in your AWS region. You don't have to think about availability zones or anything like that. Now, we were already using Lambda at our company Allogy. It actually doesn't need to work with the API gateway. And so one of the things we were doing was, for instance, we were saving some data to a database, and then we'd kick off a Lambda job, and that Lambda job would do some asynchronous processing and then save back the results. We also use it, say when we save files to S3, we can start transcoding videos or resizing images. So we're already looking at that, and I think Lambda provides some interesting use cases because you just give them some code and it runs whenever you need it. But I'll talk about its relevance for API Gateway tonight. So this here is a Java 8 Lambda function. It's pretty simple. It is a Java function. So you give it some sort of input. Here I call it /command request. Lambda runs your code, and then you get a response. So in terms of input, it has to be a JSON object or something that can be deserialized from a JSON object. And then in terms of output, it has to be something that you can serialize to a JSON object. And there are no Java servlets. I like that aspect of it. They just start the JVM and then invoke your code. You just start where the function is. We have input and output. So this is a Python function, very similar concept. You just have a function called, and you do some interesting work, and you return an object. So this is API Gateway, and it really is what it sounds like. It's just an HTTP server with a few rules and caveats. So it's a managed HTTP gateway. You don't have to run any EC2 instances or run any kind of servers to have that gateway. So you can connect it to your own server if you want, but I think what's really interesting is you can connect it to Lambda. And when you connect it to Lambda, then when an HTTP request comes into the gateway, it'll transform it to a Lambda input, run your code, and then return an HTTP response. So this thing here can be your backend architecture. You don't have to have any EC2 instances. You don't have to have a load balancer. They can take care of that for you. So I think it can also be really interesting for personal projects because it's really cheap. So this is how we did the Slack command. Now, I will cheat a little bit, or I did cheat a little bit, because the presentation that Tim gave was actually about Slack bots. You actually can't do that with API Gateway because the Slack bot requires, requires a, what is the term? The web request that stays open.
WebSocket?
Yes, WebSocket, yeah. And so you can't do that, so I actually did a Slack command, which is just a simple API request. And so what they do is, you type in /health is what we have, and then Slack, that goes from your client to your Slack server, and then that goes to the API gateway back to Lambda. And then for our use case, we actually call AWS APIs to get some monitoring information. So we actually don't even need a database. So in this case, that was everything we had to do to hop over, look at some of the monitoring information, and then respond back into Slack. And it's not a call that gets made terrible amounts, so it's nice that it's just this little function that doesn't have to be sitting on an EC2 server, wasting space. So a lot of backends do need a database. AWS offers this other thing called DynamoDB. It's also fully serverless. So you don't have to start a DynamoDB server or any other kind of server. You do have to know the throughput to provision for it. So I don't really like how that part works of it, but if you like DynamoDB, this could be another approach, and you don't have to have any single server running. But probably want a relational database instead. I think recently Amazon added some support so that you can run your code in a VPC. So normally, you have a server instance and it's behind a firewall, or maybe it has a private IP address. So I've actually not tested this particular function out, but I think you can now run your Lambda code in such a way that it can access a SQL server that you have hidden in your VPC. Okay, so unfortunately, it's not all magic. If you want to get an HTTP request, you do have to make some velocity template to map it. So in this case, this is what the slash command looks like. The way the slash command works is they give you this, they pass in query parameters. So like they'll pass in a token, my secret. And then you have to actually take that and then map it using this velocity template into a JSON object. And then that JSON object gets put into the Lambda. That's what goes into the Lambda function. So there is a little bit of configuration you have to do in regards to that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the good things and some of the bad things I found. So again, really I think one of the best things about this is you don't have any servers or load balancers. It's just there and it works, and it's worked pretty consistently for us. We've actually not had any issues with it in terms of actually executing. The second is you configure the gateway. You don't program it, so you can have some sort of configuration file and supply that to them. There's no coding you need on the gateway side. Of course, you do need to write code for your Lambda function, because you're probably doing something interesting, and that normally requires code. It also supports Swagger, Open API, which I think is a fantastic standard. So you can actually have your configuration in Swagger. They have built-in monitoring for their functions, and what I like about this is it's a really high level information. So, typical monitoring: how much memory am I using? What are my CPU cycles? You can maybe add some of your own monitoring that says, hey, I'm getting 500 errors. But they have built-in monitoring that automatically is configured for, how many times the function was invoked, did any of them fail, and that's all out of the box. They also have a staging concept. So basically, you put some code in a development stage, perhaps, and then you move it over to testing, test it out, see how it works, and then finally you can go on to production. I think it's also fairly secure. That you don't have to maintain security patches, and it also uses IAM roles for anyone who's familiar with those. So you don't even have to have access keys to access your AWS resources. Dealing with access keys can really be a pain. You have to find a way to get them into your code without storing them in GitHub. So I did find a number of problems when I used it. One of the biggest ones actually is that the latency of the very first request was really slow. So this Slack request took us about 3 seconds to respond to, maybe 4. Basically, Lambda has to start a container. That's their internal part. You don't have much insight into it. And it takes some bit of time for them to get the container up and running. And then they run your code, and the code is pretty fast. It just makes a few API requests. But all of that loading of the container is slow. After that it's fast. We had no problems once it was actually up and running. And they have some sort of caching mechanism where your function stays loaded, and so you can make multiple requests, and they're pretty fast. Originally, I was thinking this would be a really interesting option for things that you don't use a lot. But then I discovered this problem, and I found this might actually be a problem for things you use a lot if you want them to respond quickly. So it's just something to keep in mind. I felt the automation support was not great. Like I said, you can configure in Swagger, and they actually have a really, really easy to set up console. So you can set everything up in the UI. It's really easy. But who wants to keep your configurations in a console? You want them in source control somewhere so that you can always reproduce. They have support for that, but you have to do a lot of tooling to actually make it work. So that was quite unfortunate. No offline support. So your Lambda functions are just functions. So you can unit test them, you can integration test them. It's really not that hard. But say you have a client that you want to have calling that Lambda function, and you want to be maybe working on both of them in parallel. Well, you got to be pushing code to Lambda so that you can execute it, because you can't just have your, you can't have a local server that's calling your Lambda functions. Maybe someone will make something like that, but in the meantime, you have to deploy in order to test it as a client. And that I think is rather unfortunate. Vendor lock-in, so obviously you have to have AWS. We're actually really happy with AWS, so this doesn't bother me at all, but obviously it's significant for a lot of people. And then another problem is it only supports JSON, so that means you cannot serve up images, you can't have binary data, can't take in binary data. So you're stuck with JSON, which we mostly love. I think they have support for XML. I don't really care to use XML, so I never tried it.
David, you got just a couple minutes.
Okay, great. So this is my last slide. Basically, I just see this as an interesting level of abstraction. So we went from hardware to virtual machines, containers, and now there's this Lambda concept where code just happens to run when you need it. So I think it's interesting to see it go up, wonder where we might go from there. And then another question I had regarding containers is, if you're using containers already, does this provide enough abstraction to warrant a whole new tool in your tool set? So that's mostly it. I just wanted to give you all a quick introduction to this tool. I actually think it's really fun. I had a lot of fun programming it, and I think there are some really useful use cases for it. So I'm going to use it at Allogy more and in my personal projects where it seems fit. So hopefully y'all can find some interesting use out of it as well. All right. Thank you.
Really quick if you can.
Just really quick, do you know what languages Lambda supports now?
So it supports Java 8, Python, and Node.js. And technically, you can actually run any language that's in their container. So I actually made a job. I don't know if you're familiar with image exif, I think is what it's called. It's a Perl script, and they have Perl installed on their container, so it's not natively supported. But you can make like a Python script that calls an exec function and runs the Perl script, as long as you include that in your zip file. So you have more options, you just have to kind of work around it a little bit.
Is this the last talk of the night?
Yep.
All right, last talk of the night.
I'm gonna kind of maybe give a warning about 12 or 13 till the hour, and
No problem.
maybe about 10 till. I don't know. Yeah, you can see the clock back there.
Yeah, sort of. Cool. Hey everyone, so my name is Rachel Simone Weil. I am a developer evangelist working in open source at Microsoft. That is a thing. I'm going to be talking about cognitive services APIs, which I didn't actually work on developing them, even though I do work at Microsoft. So I don't have any like special insight into how they were built or anything like that. I'm just kind of speaking as someone who has used them and has kind of dug into the technology behind them and think that they're sort of cool. So they're really super simple. So mostly I want to just sort of say, hey, they exist, and then show you a project that I built with them. So APIs are awesome. I feel like nobody here needs to, like, we don't need to belabor what is an API. But so when I kind of come from the web world, and when I think of APIs, I'm usually thinking about either grabbing or pushing out data, right? And so the cognitive services APIs kind of say, well, what if you could have this API that would give you access to machine learning or sort of computer vision as a service that you can access through an API. So that's kind of the idea with Microsoft Cognitive Services. So there are certain problems that, like, anyone that wants to integrate machine learning into their app, there are a lot of machine learning problems that we don't really need to reinvent over and over. So if you think about things like text recognition or facial detection or things like that, those are things that are really common scenarios for machine learning. And there's a lot of there's a big barrier to getting into understanding how to build machine learning models to do this thing that basically everyone kind of wants to do. So what Microsoft did was like, oh, hey, there are these common scenarios that people want machine learning for. Why don't we build an API to actually give people access to this? So instead of us having to write a machine learning model for facial recognition, we can literally just send an image to this API and get returned back some information about let's say the facial features or how many people are in a photo or something like that. So Microsoft Cognitive Services actually encompasses 21 different APIs. They aren't new, they're just kind of newly put in under this umbrella of cognitive services. So things like Bing APIs, the search APIs, the auto suggest, and then also Project Oxford, which is a lot of the computer vision stuff. These have been around for a while, so if you guys remember like howled.net and like Twins or Not, I think they were kind of making the rounds last year. Those were all built on these computer vision APIs. So their things have been kind of battle tested, but they're basically kind of all put under one roof. And if you want to check out the website for it, it's microsoft.com/cognitive. So the cognitive services APIs kind of fall into these 5 categories. Vision, so that's like computer vision. Speech, so that'd be things like speaker recognition. We also have like text-to-speech APIs, things like that. And then language and knowledge are a little bit more domain specific, so I'm not really going to talk about those too much. But then finally there's search as well. And these are all of the APIs. I'm really not going to talk about all of them. It's more like, hey, look, they exist, here they are. And I've mostly used the computer vision and speech APIs personally. I don't really, like a lot of the projects I make with these APIs are just sort of fun, whimsical things. I'm not really doing enterprise scale code. So for me, things like academic knowledge API are things where, if you could definitely use these APIs to do something like building a help desk, right? An automated help desk that's serving content based on let's say your document repository. That's something that these APIs could do. I personally haven't done it, but you can see in the things like entity linking APIs, things like that. Again, these sort of like common scenarios for how you might be using machine learning, and then just sort of using it, like calling an API to take advantage of that as a service. So really quickly, what is cool about these cognitive services APIs? Just like kind of my personal opinion of what are the sort of greatest hits of these. Firstly, there are, like I said, many APIs that address sort of common use scenarios. So again, if you're wanting to build, let's say you run a blog and you want a recommendation engine, there's no reason for you to build a machine learning model from scratch to build this recommendation engine, right? So Cognitive Services actually has a recommendations API that you can use as a service. And all of that is hosted by Microsoft, so you don't actually have to maintain that service. You don't have to keep track of your machine learning model that's built on all of your data. It actually just lives somewhere else, and you don't really have to know or care how it works. Another thing that's really awesome about it is it actually has an in-browser visual console, so you can test the APIs before you sign up for them or get a key. So this is actually a screenshot from the website. You could actually say like, hey, you could throw in your own image, or you can grab one from a URL and actually see what information it returns. And you can look at that as just raw JSON. So that's kind of a cool thing. Like, there's so many APIs that I want to try out, and it's like, cool, why don't you sign up first and get an account? And I'm like, yeah, never mind, close a tab. So I really like that you could just browse to the website and try out the API without having to sign up or get keys or anything like that to see how it works. And you could actually, if you want to use some of your own, like when I was testing this out, I was using some of my own images to see how good is this facial recognition, or how good is this object recognition API. So that was kind of a cool feature. It's going to be, no worries. It's going to be cross-platform, so that's, I mean, enough said, web API. But also, the other thing I think a lot of people don't know about this cognitive services APIs is that they're actually, all of them have a free tier, and they're pretty generous. So unless you're shipping like an enterprise size application, you can actually test these with a pretty like sizable amount of requests. So I just pulled up a couple, like the Bing image search API. You can have 1,000 transactions per month for free. Face API, you can do 30,000 transactions per month. So again, if you're just building a goofy app, like just to amuse your friends like I did, the free tier will kind of be good for that. It's not until you are looking at like a huge user base that you might be going into non-free tiers territory. So I kind of want to use the rest of the time to just quickly show you how what the API, how to use the API and what it returns. And then I want to show you a project that I built with the Face API. So I'm actually going to pop out of here for a sec. So just to see, there's almost like, I don't want to go too in depth on, oh yeah, it's not actually showing my desktop. Yeah, you gotta put it over there. There we go. You can actually see for each of the APIs, you can test it out again with your own, in the case of like anything that's using an image, your own images. If you're using like text to speech, you can put in your own text. You can try out your own speech, right? There's one of the API tests, you can actually hit record with a microphone, say something and see how well it recognizes what you've said. So that's all really cool. All of these have really nice documentation and API reference guides, but you can see here, so in this case for the facial recognition API, what you're actually getting back is in a JSON object that has basically facial coordinates and then coordinates for all the different features. So you have like left eye, outer corner, left eye, top middle vertex, and, right? So you're getting all these coordinates back based on the image you have and the size that you've given. You can also see, if we scroll down here, this API will also return things like, what is the confidence value that this person is smiling? This is 0.998% confidence that the person's smiling. Whether the person has facial hair, in this case, none detected, glasses detected, so things like that. So it's kind of cool, and you can see it's all like super readable. You can actually, again, like test things out here either by putting in your own image URL or uploading something. So you can kind of go through this for all the different APIs. Again, I feel like it's silly to belabor the point, but it's super easy to test out, and of course, without having to get the API keys. So if you do want to actually build an app, I do want to show one thing that I made. It's the Deal With It bot. So I decided I was going to use facial detection to actually throw a pair of shades on faces in a photo. So you can imagine how this works. Basically, it's I'm sending a photo to that API. It's returning back all the eye and eyebrow coordinates. And I'm doing some math to scale that to, it's actually also going to return like how far the head is turned, and if it's like turned like this, if it's kind of like skewed. So it's returning all that information. I'm using that to do some JavaScript math and to actually transform a div containing an SVG with the pixelated glasses. So however someone's face is turned, it's actually going to scale the glasses and skew them according to the face. So this is kind of funny. It's just kind of goofy. It actually doesn't upload an image to a server because I don't really want people uploading. Like, I don't want to have to like pay for that server space. So it's actually just hashing the URL. So you put an URL of an image down here in this text bar, and it's actually just like hashing it into the URL if you want to share it out via Twitter. But it's not storing it anywhere. So it doesn't cost me anything server-wise to do this, which is great because I'm cheap. So let's see if I can find my mouse here again.
You mean you don't have all the Azure credit for this?
I kind of do, but I don't want to brag. Let's see. So I found a photo from one of y'all's meetups. I guess maybe back in March. So I apologize if you're in this photo and didn't want to be. So it actually, like, one thing that's kind of funny about this, I should have known it would happen, but I didn't really think about it until I prototyped it, is like all the glasses fall at the exact same time. And this can detect up to 64 unique faces. So I was actually testing this with like Emmy audience photos, and like it was just like a million sunglasses. This is kind of amazing. And this is just drawn on top of the image, so it's not saving it as a GIF. I actually have like a pull request out for that because that was apparently it was written up on kill screen, and everyone was like, "Oh, you can't save it as a GIF, lame." But it's actually just throwing this on top of the image. The sunglasses are divs, and then the deal with it is also a div that's just thrown on top. So. Just a goofy thing to show kind of what you can do with Cognitive Services APIs. And the last thing I'll probably do is just quickly show you guys the repository for this. So I try to open source everything I do. I've got this one on GitHub. This is actually also where I deploy it. So this is both my repository where I'm sharing the code, and it's actually like the live production code. So it's hooked into Azure, it's deploying it as a Node.js app, and anytime I change the repository, it actually changes the deployment right away because it's watching that GitHub repo, which is kind of cool. And I've used it so much, like I don't recommend this version control wise, but I've been on a plane and I like go to github.com because I'm on like someone else's like phone and like I need to make a change to my code really quick. And I could actually like do that through github.com if I need to change something in production and I don't have my laptop and I don't have like my credentials to do the proper, version control thing. But yeah, definitely if you guys want to check out the GitHub repository, my username is hxlnt. And one thing I did want to note about what I did for this was I actually used a Node package to handle the cognitive services stuff. And one thing to note about that is that a lot of the computer vision APIs used to be called Project Oxford. And so the Node packages are actually still under that name. So if you're looking for Node packages to build like a Node app like this one, you should actually like search for Project Oxford, which is kind of confusing. But that's where you'll get all of the like Face API and I guess the different computer vision APIs. They're all kind of packaged under Project Oxford. So if you want to take a look at this and build your own funny app, putting, I don't know, like hats on people or like, I don't know, dog ears, a Snapchat filters, all that kind of thing. You can do that with Cognitive Services APIs. You can actually do like real businessy things with it, but it's just not my brand. So I think that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Really cool stuff. I think their offerings are pretty neat. That you can sample everything, try it, and actually test it. Because very much the same reason. When I see something, I just sign up for it.
Yeah.
But I was curious because I threw some stuff. I kind of went down a rabbit hole and found this, and that's why I'm here. But I saw this and I threw some images at it, and I saw it kind of confused with some things like upside down faces, eyebrowless faces. So I'm curious to go to Microsoft's site now and throw those same images and see what the JSON responses are. Do you know if it just like totally doesn't give you anything back, or does it give you blanks, nulls, or what does it do
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
stuff that doesn't work?
So if it doesn't detect a valid face, it just won't return a JSON object for that. It's not going to give you a JSON object of like
Partial.
one eye and a mouth over here. Like
Yeah,
it,
okay.
at some point, it's like I don't think this is a face.
Right.
I'm not going to return you
This
anything.
isn't a face.
Yeah, and that actually so I did some testing with drawings of faces, and some more realistic drawings actually were detected,
Yeah.
which was pretty cool. Animals are not detected, and that's just not part of the API. That's just out of its purview.
So I have another question kind of related to that. You were talking about, obviously this is based on machine learning. I assume that as their magic gets bigger and more powerful, your application would too?
Yeah.
Or do you?
Yeah.
You know anything about that?
Yeah. So my
Does everyone understand my question?
Yeah. So you're asking about
okay.
is a model constantly being retrained
Yeah,
without
definitely.
me necessarily having to do anything? And
Yeah,
I
like
think
in 10 years when this is
Yeah.
really advanced stuff.
Yeah.
And you're using the same API, the same calls.
Yeah.
Would it?
I would
leverage the same-
imagine
yeah.
that yes. It sounds like most of those APIs based on machine learning, because Microsoft is maintaining them, that
gonna
they're
wanna sell
also
it. Yeah.
continuously training them with new data.
Does it work with emojis? Does it recognize it? That's super important.
Does it work with emojis? I don't know. I haven't tested it.
I need sunglasses on the poop emoji stack.
I'm gonna say no. Because it is looking for, it's like looking for a couple key features to recognize it as a face. Sometimes even if you have somewhat like a girl with long bangs and the eyebrows are not visible, it will still detect as a face, but it might have some trouble, discerning where the eye is.
You
So
said
obviously,
girl, does it do sex detection?
no.
too?
I mean, it does, but
It does?
it will return like a gender. So yeah, that's one of the.
Does it do age detection? Like, does
It does,
like,
yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
So howold.net was a sort of like you would upload an image and it would tell you how old you were. So it's actually the same API. So it's returning your estimated age.
There's the emotion API I noticed too. Degree of sadness,
Yes.
anger, happiness, there's like 8 or 9 different.
Yeah. So someone made an app that it's an alarm like for waking up in the morning, and you have to make like whatever emotion it says for it to stop.
kind of
It's like smile, and like if you don't smile, like the alarm I guess doesn't shut
See, I
off.
think there's that
Well, that
one
could
app
backfire.
there's that one app where it would take a photo of you on every Git commit, and it was funny to watch your flashbacks of you like how angry. The emotion thing would be awesome on Git commits because you could like see your emotional roller
That's a
coaster.
great
ride.
idea.
Yeah.
Also, like pretty much all I do all day is make goofy things with technology. So I'm just like I'm taking all the I'm like yes, tell me more of your silly ideas.
Well,
So-
forget saving a GIF, just have it, directly shared to Facebook.
No, we need to say that.
There you go. Any other questions?
And you get paid to do this.
So cool, right?
So
Is that
great.
what that means? Is that what your job is?
Good
And you
job.
don't have the scary like evangelist tag technically either, right? You do have the scary evangelist
Is
tag?
it scary?
Well, I know some people that think it's scary. I don't, but I know some people.
I don't know.
Scary for them or for us?
I think it's like, people are scared of what they don't understand.
Right.
Like, I don't know, I'm scared. I don't know.
The unscary evangelist. I'll put that on my business card. I don't have a business card, but if I did.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We've only got about 10 minutes left in this room, so find these guys and ask them questions about the great presentations they gave us this evening, and drink beer, and thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
So, hey. Yeah, I'm James. So I do a room in Ireland. And I wrote a Spider-Parser efficiency.
Yeah, I'm kind of inspired.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about that. Especially now that
I have
this
like
stuff they were kind of
presentation, like I treated to I was like, dude,
Yeah.
never told me you guys in Austin.
I get that.
It's like they were here in the States like a few weeks ago for the